Evening and welcome. I'm Patty Newberry. I'm the National President of the Society of Professional Journalists. And I thank you for joining us for this special program tonight presented by the Cincinnati chapter of SPJ. Tonight, we are talking with journalists, law enforcement experts, and a leading media attorney to address a very timely topic, and that is, how can journalists and police work together effectively? So I want to thank the Cincinnati chapter board, especially President Jenny McCabe and Vice President Jenny Wolfarth, for organizing the important conversation we're about to have. Our focus tonight is threefold. First, we want to consider what has happened on the front lines of protest coverage. As you're probably aware, some 400 journalists across the country have been threatened or attacked in some direct way as they have reported on the protests related to the Black Lives Matters movement. A key question here is, how can police, protesters, and journalists carry out their roles on these stories safely and effectively? A second question we want to consider has to do with hiring and retaining a diverse staff and covering the story of racism in America. And thirdly, we want to discuss whether the overall story is impacting journalists' use of social media. Joining us this evening are an esteemed group of panelists from Greater Cincinnati in alphabetical order. We have Jack Greiner. Jack is a media attorney here in Cincinnati. He's the managing partner at Cincinnati's Graydon law firm. Jatera McGee is a reporter with our NBC affiliate, WLWT Channel 5. Lieutenant Ron Murphy is with the Administrative Services Unit, Norwood Police Department. Kara Owsley is Director of Photography and a photojournalist for the Cincinnati Enquirer. Lieutenant Steve Saunders is the Public Information Officer for the Cincinnati Police Department. Nick Swartzel is News Editor for City Beat. And potentially joining us later will be Walter Smith-Randolph. Walter is a reporter with our CBS affiliate, WKRC-TV, Channel 12 here in Cincinnati. Oh, and I'm sorry, got to turn the page, didn't mean to overlook Kristen Swilley. Kristen is a reporter with our ABC affiliate, WCPO, Channel 9 here in Cincinnati. So given the size of our panel tonight, we won't be taking live questions, but we will try to address some that were submitted in advance. And we do encourage you to add your questions to the chat field, and we'll try to get to those as well. We also wanted to mention that Cincinnati SPJ, the Cincinnati Police Department, the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office, and other City of Cincinnati officials have been working closely for more than 5 years, offering regular seminars to develop more fruitfully the relationship between media and law enforcement. And so that's a feather in their cap and another great reason to join SPJ. All right, with thanks to everyone for being here, let's start by reviewing the situation in Cincinnati. We'll begin with journalists, and then we'll ask our other panelists to weigh in. So starting with Jatera, Kara, Nick, and Kristen, can you each offer some kind of observation about where we are in this moment? What has been going well in terms of protest coverage, or what has not? Just offer one example, since again, we have a lot of voices to get in the conversation, going well or not going so well in terms of protest coverage. Which of our journalists would like to go first?
I will go first.
Thank you, Kara.
Thanks for having me. When I heard that question, it's really a tough question. When I think about my experiences covering the first couple nights of the protest when things were really, really tense, I was in the crowd when the crowd got tear gassed on Saturday night. That would have been May 30th, the second night. I had never been tear gassed before. But then when I started reading more about other photojournalists across the country, there was one in particular that lost an eye because that police department, I believe in Minneapolis, used rubber bullets, and that photojournalist lost an eye. So if I had to compare my situation to that photojournalist, I'd say it went well for me. There were other issues, but that's the main thing, is that I got home safely. I didn't have any injuries. The tear gas was really difficult to deal with at that moment, but I got home safely with no injuries.
Can we have another journalist weigh in? Something that's gone well or not gone well, you and your colleagues covering this story?
I'll go next.
Thank you, Nick.
I'd say one opportunity for improvement was journalists being able to identify themselves to police and being able to gain access to, say, arrests, being able to observe things they needed to do for their job. And it seemed like sometimes little lanyards and things like that just weren't really cutting it in terms of gaining the access that we needed. And so I think that falls both on the department and the city to provide some guidance, and on journalists to maybe step up their game by getting vests and things like that. Yeah, there were times when I was caught in situations where I was also exposed to OC or what, like where I think like that that exposure might not have happened in the same way had they known I was press, and maybe wouldn't have shot that in my direction. So.
Okay, so the lack of identification or sufficient identifying signifiers might have been helpful.
Yeah, and guidance on what that would be too, I think.
Okay, good. We'll talk about those things. Kristen or Jatara?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and speak up really quickly. So my personal experience was pretty smooth. I covered also the initial nights of the protest. Obviously, one of the things that sort of sticks out from our station in particular, as we talk about identification, is we had a situation early June where we had a reporter and photographer who were very clearly marked and found themselves in the middle of a situation where they wound up getting sort of shoved out of the way. And but we also had, I believe, an Inquirer reporter or photographer that was taken into custody. I know that their colleagues can probably speak more directly to that, but just maybe this is an opportunity just to have, I don't know if it's differences in training or kind of, what else can be done. But I know that in our case, both our photographer and reporter felt that they were doing the right thing, the best they could do. And from reviewing the video that I've seen, it seems like they were just sort of caught in the middle of this situation that I don't know how, in retrospect, would have been handled differently. Had I been in their shoes. I was listening to it happen in real time on the opposite side of town and then watching it back. I'm still trying to work through, and I think they're still trying to work through exactly what went wrong there. So yeah, to Nick's point.
Mm-hmm. Jatara.
I think we learned a lot in those first few nights, especially, and we're kind of learning as we went in terms of where the best places were for us to stand as journalists when there were these confrontations, and it all moved so quickly, and trying to figure out where we could get the angle to show the audience what's going on, but also try to keep ourselves safe. One thing that I really appreciated is that CPD, Lieutenant Saunders, were really accessible. I felt those first few nights. We have a WhatsApp that goes out to everyone in media, I believe, which is somewhat helpful, but also just over text, they were very helpful getting back and forth to us. And that's really helpful, just being in the moment, and we're in wall-to-wall live coverage, no breaks for several hours, and being able to text them and say, hey, do you know how many arrests? One thing that I do think was problematic is that with any department, sometimes information gets out there that's not accurate, and they do their best to correct it quickly. But in a situation like this, it's so much more important to have accurate information, and especially in the climate of fake news and people not trusting journalists or police. I think it's even more important that we're double checking before we put information out there. I know there was a pretty big arrest during maybe the third or fourth night of protests in which someone had allegedly, it was put out, pointed a gun at a journalist and their security guard. So of course we all started panicking, and we're trying to figure out which crew it was. And I don't even know what it ended up being. That was later retracted. I think it ended up being a security guard at a private business or something, but it wasn't what the situation was initially put out to be. And that's tough when we put that information out there. Hey, police just told us this, and we're reporting that over and over again for several hours, and then the next day have to recant and step back from that. So I think that's one thing that we could be better. There were several opportunities where police we appreciate putting the information out there, but several corrections made in those first few nights that made it a little bit tough.
Mm-hmm. Lieutenant Sanders, can you weigh in from your perspective? What do you think has gone well with media coverage of this very important story, or could have gone better?
Sure, Patty, thanks for having me, and honored to be a part of this panel. Some of the points that have already been brought up obviously will be maybe further discussion here, and we've already had plenty of discussion before this panel has occurred about that interaction we have with our media partners down on McMicken and Mohawk Place. But back to Jatera's point about the pointing of the firearm at the media representative and the security guard, I can tell you the firearm was pointed at media and a security guard that day. That was on June 1st at court in Maine. What we found out later was the media outlets didn't know that was happening. We got that information from a confidential informant, and obviously we're not going to give that person's information up as a confidential informant, but it was truly pointed at our media representative and a security guard that afternoon. And that firearm was an AR style rifle with a 100-round magazine that could easily have been lethal to not only those two individuals, but the hundreds of protesters that were actively protesting in the street at Court in Maine in front of the courthouse. So I just want to be clear about that. That actually did happen. We know which outlet it was. No one that had that firearm pointed at them realized that was happening to them, but we did have confirmation on that. So to be clear on that. But from the standpoint of what we did well, I think was what also Jatera mentioned was the communication piece and utilizing the WhatsApp and Twitter and direct messages, text messages. There were many times where there was false information coming out. We had the first night somebody posted on social media that a young girl was shot with a rubber bullet in the West End. First of all, we didn't have protests in the West End at all, and we don't use rubber bullets. So we were clarifying that for media representatives so we could squash any false rumors. Obviously, we could go back and forth about the situation at Mohawk and McMicken. We're still working through that. I can tell you we're actively reviewing our procedures on how we interact with the media. Next Wednesday, July 15th, I'm going to send this out after we get off of our call. We're going to host a focus group with our local media outlets to get your perspective so we can help better understand how we can inform our officers. And there's definitely some lessons we can learn from that as a department, but we also want to highlight how well we work with our local media partners and have been doing that for many, many years. So, and thanks to Ginny and Tom McKee for helping us explore that relationship. So that's my input.
Very good. Ron Murphy, Lieutenant Ron Murphy. How about in Norwood? Have you had some specific protests in Norwood, and have there been some pros and cons of your interactions with media? And unmute yourself if you would.
Yeah, we were extremely lucky in the last 6 weeks that we did. We had a very, very, very small peaceful protest in front of our city hall of just 6 to 8 people. So we did not have near the protest or the peaceful, whatever was going on down in Cincinnati. We kept getting alerts from social media that we were going to have problems, but we didn't have anything. And again, watching what Cincinnati was going through and how dynamic and quick changing those things were, it was just difficult to watch. And I think they did an amazing job, with dealing with everything that was going on. It's not easy, again, because of the ever-changing, the dynamics of a protest that can turn violent quickly. And sometimes you don't know where the violence came from. So, but we were incredibly lucky. I did have to deal with the protests when I was a patrol officer in 2001. And it's very scary and it's difficult even for a police officer to be in there. So I can also understand for a journalist to be there in the middle of the protest. Just the chaos that goes on, again, is difficult to comprehend if you've never been involved in one.
So Jack Reiner, you're watching these events nationally and locally. Any thoughts on what you saw and whether you thought things were handled well, or that there could have been some improvements in terms of the relationship between media and law enforcement?
Well, I think that's sort of a two-part question. Part one is just sort of nationally, and what we've seen. Obviously, we saw some pretty appalling conduct. I'm thinking of the CNN reporters who were just clearly CNN reporters who got arrested. I mean, it couldn't have been any more plain and just in real time for no good reason. That didn't involve violence. But, you know, the situations that Kara talked about with a reporter losing their eye, you had student journalists in Columbus from the OSU Lantern who were tear gassed and clearly showing their credentials. I mean, when you watch the video, there's just there's no room for argument that they were clearly had their credentials. They made it very clear, and the officer had no interest in having any kind of real communication. It was just get out, get out, get out, get out, you know, and then tear gas. So yeah, and I do think to Nick's point about the identification, that actually raises a tricky issue because, you know, you've got apparently somebody who's motivated to point an AR-15 at the media. So do you, how visibly, you know, how visible do you want to be as media for your own safety? But, you know, you need to be recognizable to the police. And I think ideally, you know, easily recognizable. I think sometimes there's been some less than fully honest statements by police, with all due respect, about how it was difficult to tell that somebody was a journalist. I don't think that's been the case in every instance, but I think it raises an issue. I think maybe the thing to do is think about, you know, how can there be something where you are the police know easily that you're a journalist, but maybe the general public doesn't. And I don't know what that is exactly, but it's not quite as easy as wearing a very visible vest. I mean, that raises, you know, some potential risk. And I don't want to go on too long. The last thing I'll say is I'm just a little concerned. You know, Steve's great, Ron's great. Every interaction I've ever had with those guys, fantastic. They get it. You know, how do you push that down to the rank and file throughout? And you know, I think I've had conversations with people who say, well, you know, why is the media getting in the way? Why are they there? If you know, it's dangerous, they shouldn't be there. It's like, well, it's as much their job to be there as it is the police job to be there. And again, I think Steve gets that, Ron gets that, but I think a lot of the line officers don't, and demonstrated that, unfortunately, over the course of these protests.
So that sets us up well for start talking about some solutions, and specifically this idea of how you identify yourself at the scene, right? The line between having enough identification that gives you the access that you need when you need it, real time, but does not make you a target to somebody who might want to do you harm, right? So do you wear the big yellow vest that says press, or do you wear something less? Is it enough to have a lanyard and pick up that lanyard and show it to the officer who's asking for your identification? So I'll start with Kara. Like, you're out there and you've got to do your job and you've got to move fast when the moment calls for it. So what's the appropriate kind of identifiers?
I don't know what is appropriate. I was just going to make a comment. What I did that Saturday night, the May 30th, I was walking down Vine, and I was trying to go up the hill. I was trying to go up the hill, and I was stopped by the police, said you can't cross, because I was trying to walk up to UC, where it was just going nuts up there, and I couldn't get up the hill. So I just told the officer. He was very, very nice about it. And I said, okay. And I turned around and went back down the hill, because we already had 2 photographers at the top of the hill. So when I'm coming back down towards downtown, there was a police officer, and I'm not sure exactly what the proper term is, but the guns that kind of look like a paintball gun. When I got down to Liberty, he pointed it at me, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm about to get these pepper balls or whatever. I'm like, he's about to take me down. And clearly I had 2 cameras with me, not hiding them. And I had a bag that goes across. It's a small camera bag. I had the lanyard on, but 2 big cameras on both shoulders. And he pointed it right at me. And I picked up my lanyard. I'm like, I'm with the press. And he put it down and he said, "You're fine." So at that point, I was a little shooken up, and I just stood there for a minute and just observed that scene for a while. I didn't have any more issues that night. So that has been an ongoing thing with me and my photo staff. It's like, do we want to wear those vests? Because the other thing we're dealing with is not just the police, but some of the protesters and demonstrators, they don't want the media there. So you don't want to, we're, as photographers, we're already sticking out. As reporters, they're already sticking out. They have a mic in their hands or whatever equipment that they have. We stick out really well, and it's hard for us to blend in. In 2015, when the protests broke out, then it was really, really different from this time. So we had to approach it totally differently.
Maybe I'll ask the two TV reporters to jump in here. You have to stick out. You have to be on the scene with a camera on your face to get your opening shot, your closing shot, or a live shot, whatever kind of package you're putting together. So what are your thoughts on how you identify yourself, what's enough, what's too much?
I'm with Kara and not knowing what exactly the answer is. What we were told from our station as we got, especially as we got further into the protest, was make sure, I think this was coming down from the police department as well, make sure that your press badge is out, make sure that you have something to identify you. So our station had us wear our polos, we were wearing hats. But what I noticed, the protesters who didn't want us there, as soon as they would see that logo, you became a target. So you may have been safe from getting, from the police directing tear gas or something in your direction, but you weren't necessarily safe from the protesters who we were marching with and walking with, trying to follow them all night long. So I don't know what the answer is. It's tough. And I know that a photographer from one of the media outlets in town suggested, you should wear a neon vest. That's what a lot of us are doing. And I was like, I want nothing to do with that, because as it is, we're standing out enough, and we were trying to just blend in as much as we could to show the story without people getting in the camera and trying to throw things our direction. So it's a really tough balance.
So Kristen, I watch Channel 9 most nights, and you are out there every night. and I'm thinking at home, laying in my bed safely, you are a giant target right now, right? It's dark. There's not many people around. So what are your thoughts on whether you identify yourself as a journalist? How much, too much, how much is too little?
Sure. Our station chose to err on the side of not in that very first night, because it was just breaking so rapidly that we had to go where we had to go with what we had on, with the equipment that we had. But as things evolved over the next couple of days, getting pretty sizable, I mean, probably this big badges that had like our about here size of a picture on it with our names and our outlets outlined on like a neon tape. We didn't have anything on our backs or anything that was like a full 360 identification. But, I never felt, and maybe I'm unique in this, I never felt targeted necessarily from the protesters. I understood the fact that a lot of people didn't want to have their faces recorded. And so if I got confronted with that, I would just tell them, okay, we're going to be shooting right here, stay out of our range type thing. If someone allows you to have that conversation. A lot of times people don't want to talk and they're frustrated. And this is obviously a very emotionally charged issue for the people that are out there. But we err on the side of more identification because the bigger impact that could be had to us over a longer period of time is, the impact that we might be getting from the police if we're not readily identifying ourselves, and then we do wind up getting caught in the middle of something. I feel like there's more potential there, honestly, for more physical harm to be done. So we chose to err on the side of identification.
Nick, any different for you as someone who doesn't necessarily have to carry a camera, although maybe you do, working for a print and online publication?
Yeah, so I do carry a DSLR with me, but I can also put that in a backpack if it feels like the situation's tense and I need to sort of blend into the background. I have a lanyard with a piece of ID on it that's easy to tuck away into something. I think the vest would change that dynamic. I have not had a lot of like super tense interaction with protesters. Mostly they've been pretty forthcoming with me. But I do see how that could change the dynamic. It's something I would be hesitant to try, but maybe willing, depending on the level of tenseness at the protest. It felt like things got really tense. I might tuck that vest in the backpack too for my own safety at some point. So, yeah.
And our two police officers, do you have a preference? What would you like to see journalists wear or not wear, carry or not carry at a protest scene?
I guess I'll jump in first. So we had a conversation the next day after our encounter with the two or three journalists really at Mohawk and McMicken, where we had our interaction. And one was a Channel 9 reporter and a photographer. And as Kristen said, they had a very large lanyard. And I think that it was a very dynamic situation. They got caught up in the mix in that situation. The other lanyard was fairly small, and it was difficult probably to discern exactly if this person was a media representative or not. I think somebody said earlier, it's this balancing act of not identifying yourself too much to protesters who might be wanting to not interact with the media or have their faces shown, and be readily visible enough to law enforcement. We talked the next day after that encounter with the news directors, and what I didn't realize, because we suggested vests, they said that would make the reporters and their staff too visible. And there's people that get confused. I think Kara talked about carrying her cameras. There are a lot of citizen journalists out there. There are people that are there with the protesters that are taking pictures for their own blogs and their own social media posts that look like journalists. So sometimes it's difficult to discern who's a journalist and who's not. Maybe there's a way, as we talk about this further, to have a armband or something that doesn't say journalist on it, but something that identifies you to our officers, and our officers know that you're a journalist based on seeing that. But we have to work through that. I'm looking for best practices myself, because we want to have our own practices and procedures that are going to be helpful in the future. But it's tough. I mean, because you guys, I saw Evan Millward get hit with a bottle at Vine and Liberty. I know Dan from Channel 5 was hit with rocks and things. So other folks have been targeted as members of the media. So we're the same way. We're trying to find the best solution. Ultimately, we want to keep that communication going, so we figure it out.
And Lieutenant Murphy, any additional thoughts there? A lanyard at minimum?
Definitely there needs to be something, again, because it is so dynamic and things are so quick moving that it can be extremely difficult for an officer to find something small. A vest to me sounded like a great idea, but like Steve said, I had no idea that the media was targeted as much as they are when they're reporting. I mean, I've seen people say, I don't show my face, but that could be scary too. I mean, so something, the armband sounds good. Maybe just an orange armband that would be universal, at least in Hamilton County, to the police officers in Hamilton County. So, well, if they've got an orange armband on, that means they're part of the media. It might be something that sounds like a good idea, but it would be great to find just a general common practice that we could all agree on.
Kara.
I used to work at the Times-Picayune in New Orleans, Louisiana, some years ago. And when I first got hired, the first stop that we made, my first day at work, was to the New Orleans Police Department. And we had an ID badge that the police department provided. So I wore that to every crime scene or anything where the police would be there. So they would clearly know that I was official media and I wasn't like a citizen journalist or whatever. So it was very identifiable. It was very helpful.
Okay. Let's stick with practical considerations here and talk about what you journalists participating tonight, what you do to prepare to go out to cover a protest. What do you pack? What do you put in your car? What kind of conversations do you have with your editors or your colleagues? What do you do to protect your safety as you head out to what could be a volatile situation?
I'll start just because I've been taking notes about this question. I've had this question a couple times. The big difference covering this protest from 2015, 2016 is that we were dealing with COVID. So that first night, like Kristen said, we were just it wasn't anything that was super planned, and we found out about the protest, so you just run out. But our first thing was make sure you take an extra mask, hand sanitizer, wipes, that type of thing, take water. And then as the days went on, you had to realize, okay, if the police department is using tear gas, we need to get goggles. So I had a photographer run to Home Depot and buy pretty much all the goggles he could find, that kind of thing. The other thing I did, we didn't go out the door without writing Jack's number on our arm in a Sharpie in case we got arrested. I don't have Jack's number memorized. So I had Jack's number on one arm and I had my supervisor's on the other arm. And then I tend to always take something like granola bars, because we were out for hours. I mean, probably at one point 9 or 10 hours, just walking and walking and walking from start to finish of those protests. So I took food, extra masks, water, and then I ran out of water. So you try to get it wherever you can. And then the other thing, comfortable shoes. All that walking, 2 days, I walked like 21 miles. Comfortable shoes. I brought a change of clothes just in case I needed it. Extra batteries for the camera. Those type of things that I usually tend to have.
What else? Did Kara's list miss anything? Sounded pretty comprehensive.
I think those are pretty comprehensive lists. It's a little bit of a different challenge for television reporters because we're doing so many live shots. And of course, there's nowhere to keep your things. So you don't want to have this huge backpack on when they come to you. So I think I had a few nights I went with just a really small backpack, and the majority of the nights I just had my phones. And then when we'd get back to a place near our car, I could run and get water or snack or things like that. But spare iPhone chargers were a big thing, having as many chargers as possible. And then on the other note of how do you prepare in terms of the coverage and what you need to research in advance, I think a more interesting question I'd like to address is some of the ways that you prepare when you don't know it's coming. So that first night, we had no idea that protests were going to happen here. Having already done the homework in the communities that these issues are affecting helped so much that night. It helped so much that night that we had run a regular piece before things escalated and got a little crazy, just with Chief Isaac talking to some of his District 4 officers about the death of George Floyd and some other local reaction from police officers, and having those conversations and knowing what they had said directly to their departments, and then talking to Chief Isaac that night before things got crazy. I had the context of being able to say, hey, here's where police stand on this, and also here's where the community stands on this, and here are some of the issues that have been here for years and years. What you're seeing isn't just reaction and people frustrated about the death of George Floyd. There's more to it. And having that context helped so much that night. So I think it's important that sometimes as journalists, we can kind of box ourselves in on those issues that we're covering in the moment, the big story at coronavirus for the last couple of months, but taking a step back whenever possible and thinking about the issues that are impacting the community all the time. So when there is a major protest or something like that, you have that in the back of your head and can pull out that knowledge.
Christian, any conversation you had with your bosses in your newsroom? What did they tell you as they sent you out the first time, the second time on the protest story?
Well, obviously just, making safety a first and foremost our priority, but also really talking about some of the language that we used, to Jatera's point, back in 2001, and how things have evolved to where we are now. We've even gone from calling what happened in 2001, people commonly refer to that as, it was the riots back in 2001. We call that civil unrest. We talk about, again, to Jatera's point, making sure that we do more research and that we don't vilify the protesters and despite what goes on, and we don't overly uplift what's going on with the police, and making sure that we're really, or vice versa, and making sure that we're really trying to create the most balanced narrative that we can, because it's natural to walk into a situation like that and see what's being done, the property damage and things like that, and then just follow like sort of an obvious narrative. But I've grown and learned and researched a lot in the past couple of weeks, and it's really, I've been trying to read more about some of the famous texts that a lot of these, different demonstrators, different protesters have been basing their argument on, because I do think it's natural for us. We get so much information straight from the police, and we've always taken it, I think a lot of us, as just scripture, and to try and make sure we need to do a better job, regardless of our individual backgrounds, of presenting a more balanced narrative. So I really like what Jatera was saying there. That's so important. That might be the most important thing you can walk in with. And we just underwent diversity training as a station maybe a little less than a year ago. Extensive multi-day at headquarters diversity training to make sure that we understood how best to cover issues affecting people of color, specifically African Americans. And I really do feel like that training played into hopefully our coverage in real time.
That's great. If we have time, we'll come back to that. Let's bring Walter Smith Randolph into the conversation. First, welcome.
Hello.
Thanks for being here. We're talking about safety on the streets, what things you have done, your colleagues have done to stay safe on the street, but we've covered that pretty well. So let me ask you a more specific question, which is whether you're being told by your bosses really kind of tactical strategies, like if the police say this, do this. If a protester says X, here's a good response, right? You're giving some kind of talking through the scenarios that might happen.
We didn't really talk about talking through scenarios. I think it basically was about being safe and making wise decisions. So if you feel that you are in an unsafe position, then you need to bail, So safety has come first. I know for my station, I think most of the stations, we hired personal security. So, you know, I think it was the third night of the protest, we had personal security that was going around with us. And I think in some cases that actually emboldened people. You know, at one point we were in front of the courthouse, and all of the media was standing on the median in front of the courthouse, if you're familiar with where the Hamilton courthouse is. And all of a sudden we saw police swarm this car, and everyone just kind of like scattered, and we were like, what's going on? And then police came and showed us the AR-15 that these people were pointing at the media, but our backs were to them. So, you know, that happened. At one point, I had people just run into the middle of my live shot, and I pushed them back, and that emboldened them. And so the security guard had to step in between, and then they started throwing bottles at us. And so at that point, I walked away. So I think you know, as far as managers don't, you know, they wouldn't really kind of walk us through if this happens, that happens. It basically was a priority of being safe. I think there was some discussion, I think particularly with me, because I like to talk back, if you know me. So I think, you know, say, well, maybe today is not the day that you should be talking back, Walter. And so that's something that I kept in mind as far as being out on the streets.
Thank you. I want to ask Jack to weigh in here on some practical legal considerations, two specifics. First of all, I think journalists are under the impression that when you're in the public venue, all is fair, right? You can collect the image you want, you can collect the sound you want. If the person you've asked to talk to you engages, then you're good. So first one, kind of rules of engagement in the public venue is my first question. And the second is, what would you have done if Kara had to call you? Meaning, what happens if a journalist is arrested in covering a protest?
Well, first of all, Kara used a Sharpie. I was trying to get a permanent tattoo, but you know, I think I'll start with the second question first. Really, I think in the first instance, in this type of environment, you know, I think try to solve the immediate problem. I would, as an attorney, I would try to get, and frankly, it happened really with Pat Brennan on McMillan. I mean, that fortunately resolved itself in the moment. I mean, he was released from detention fairly quickly, and it wasn't as a result of any formal legal. I wasn't even involved, actually. So, but I think had I been, I would have done, you know, what the folks at the Enquirer did, which was get to a supervisor as quickly as possible, explain what was going on, and just try to get it resolved promptly. So, you know, among other things, so the reporter can get back to his or her job. So I think that we ought not lose sight of the need or the benefit of just trying to deal with the immediate issue, which is to stop in process, what was a completely illegitimate detention of a reporter. And that was best handled by, talking to people. So backing up for a minute, these types of interactions are helpful in that regard. The Cincinnati Bar Association does twice a year what we call a media bench bar forum, and law enforcement comes to that. So we've developed relationships that we kind of know who to call, to address these situations promptly. And now I forgot your first question.
Has to do with the right of journalists to do their jobs in a public space.
Yeah, I mean, they do. And honestly, to say journalist is maybe a little narrower than it is. I mean, citizens have a right under the First Amendment to record police activity. They can't interfere with an arrest or a pursuit, but you don't need a press card to take a picture or video of police activity. And, the federal courts of appeals that have been faced with that question have uniformly ruled that it's a First Amendment right. So, it's not just limited to journalists, but clearly, journalists, and we've counseled, our clients, and they know that, yeah, they are entitled to be there. And I think you've got to be, you don't want to get in confrontations, but you can't just roll over either and back off. I mean, I think, you have the right to, you should, and this is where I think the education on the part of police and journalists comes, is that you ought to have you should feel empowered to engage in some conversation when a police officer is telling you, you need to be over there. Well, maybe you don't need to be over there. And, ideally, the Cincinnati Police Manual says that, they have a duty to de-escalate situations. So that situation ought not get to a point of an arrest or a detention. There ought, the reporters have a right to question, if they're told, get over there, why? I mean, if they're not in the way, if they're not interfering with an arrest or a pursuit, the notion that they have to do exactly what the police tell them to do and go exactly where the police tell them where to go I just don't think that's accurate. And I think that is not consistent with First Amendment right of the press and frankly, the people to record activity. So, I think at the end of the day, we don't want our folks arrested. We certainly don't want our folks pepper sprayed or, tear gassed. And, they're cautioned to avoid that. But I also think that, the answer is not to just, just blindly accept direction without at least trying to have some dialogue with the police. That's tricky though, as we've seen.
Mm-hmm. So I think that calls for a police response. Why do Lieutenant Sanders and Lieutenant Murphy, why do you sometimes need to direct media on where to stand or not stand?
Yeah, I think there are, go ahead, Ron, you want to weigh in first?
I was just you have a lot more experience, but the first thought that came to my mind is the media doesn't know what our plan of attack is at any certain time during a chaotic situation. So they may think that, oh, this is good here and I can be here and I'm not interfering, but we might want to be moving people that direction. So we're doing the media a favor, getting them out of there because we're going to move a crowd in a different direction. So that was my first thought. And a lot of these times we're talking specifically about what's been going on the last, 4 weeks or so, around the country. We don't have time to have dialogue at that point. I mean, it's not the time to have dialogue. If we're giving a command or directive, we just need the media to kind of, at least for that moment, be on our side and just agree to do what we're going to do, and we can have the dialogue later and we can explain our reasoning.
I'll add on to that real quick. The best advice is to follow your own advice, which is what SPJ puts out on your website and what you have. There's a link to, I think it's Pointer, or I'm not sure the outlet, but it's a guide for journalists for dealing with covering unrest. And it says a guide for journalists, your goal should be to get close enough to observe the scene without endangering yourself or others or interfering with security or rescue operations. So when you find yourself that close to the action, you may have gotten too close. And sometimes things are very dynamic and they happen very quickly. And we get that and we want to resolve them just like we did with our encounter down on McNicken and Mohawk. But that advice that you offer through your own organization, through SPJ, is great advice. The link that you sent me, Jenny, from SPJ's panel, I think, Patty, you were part of that panel with other journalists about the same topic without law enforcement a part of it. The one gentleman who's a professor from Georgetown mentioned that he tells all of his students, journalism students, do what the police tell you to do. And you won't find yourself in a bad situation if you're not between the lines. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit of what he said, but if we find ourselves, you find yourself as a journalist getting too close to the action or in the action, you have cameras that are amazing. You can film from 5 blocks away and microphones that can pick up audio from a block away. I saw somebody doing coverage of a barn fire that was half a mile away and zoomed in on it and got great video coverage of that. So we'd ask you to be on the periphery and not be in the middle of police action. So we don't have to say, you can't stand here or we need you to move. And we're not trying to sort out a dynamic situation as we're also trying to deal with unrest and protesters and things of that nature. So that's my advice, is follow your own advice. Your best advice is your own advice.
Nick, I want to come to you, and then we're going to do a last round of kind of takeaway thinking on anything that we've covered tonight. And that would be what has been your experience and that of your reporters in the moment where police do ask them to move? And then kind of a related but corollary question, what has been the attitude toward protesters to your staff? Are folks out there protesting willing to engage, or are they more often, don't take my picture, I'll sue you if you do, kinds of responses?
Sure. Yeah. So I think the first question, my experience, and I'm usually the one doing out there doing the reporting because we have a pretty small staff, has been pretty mixed. Some officers are very willing to give you the access that you need to observe an arrest or something happening that might be tense. I was on the freeway when the protesters marched onto the freeway, and the protesters were actually streaming over the other side of the freeway, a very dangerous situation. And the officer was standing between me and the protesters, and I kind of stopped because I expected him to stop. And he's like, if you're going to get over there and cover that, you need to do it now. And I appreciated that. He trusted me to be a professional and do what I needed to do. In other circumstances, there was a mass arrest of about 100 people that was just south of Findlay Market, where I was not allowed to get within a block, and neither were 3 Enquirer reporters. Luckily, there were 2 other Enquirer reporters at the scene who were able to get that series of arrests. But I was told, you don't need to see that. And that to me is telling me I can't do my job. I need to get close enough to observe. And so I was there when Pat Brennan was arrested and filmed it and put it on Twitter. And it was a very similar example of what I thought was clearly not the correct thing to do in not letting us do our jobs. So it's been hit or miss. There are times when I've been like really impressed, and other times when I've been like, there needs to be more conversation about this.
And then how about the reaction of protesters? We haven't really had time to talk about that. Are most open and inviting coverage, or is it a mixed bag?
I've found most are pretty open. I try to, if I get a shot of like one person where it's just very like singular, I say like, hey, I took your picture. I just want you to know I took your image. Can I get your name? And if they say I don't want my image taken, then it's like, I kind of already took it. You're in public. That's the reality of the situation. And maybe if that shot doesn't end up being something that is really, really valid or important, maybe we don't put it in, but we reserve the right to do that because we're journalists and that's what we do. For the most part though, protesters have been pretty open with me. There have been some times I was there when the windows were being broken and people said, hey, don't take a picture of that. And I'm like, I'm not on your team. I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, which is documenting this. And I was left alone after that. There was no threatening or anything like that. So that's been my experience. And I'm sure it's different depending on the person and the moment and where you're at. So.
Walter, you mentioned briefly that you had some protesters jumping into your live shots. So generally, are you getting good access? Have you gotten good access to protesters, or?
For the most part, I think when you had like the first night of protests and you had the different marches going on, where it got hairy for me was one when, you know, when the curfew went into effect and the people were jumping into my live shot. I think they just I think for some people, they just thought it was a party, and that people were running around yelling "F the police" and they wanted to join in on the fun. So those people were kind of, you know, problematic. I did notice that when we went to the Duke Energy Convention Center, when they were having budget meetings, I was outside and I just went outside because they were streaming the meeting outside. So I just went to go get video, and someone yelled at me, "What are you taking a picture of?" And I was like, of you? And someone came to me and said, "You should be asking for permission." And I said, "No, I don't have to do that." And they started lecturing me about people being doxxed. And I said, "Well, you know, the same right that gives you to be out here protesting is the same right for me to do my job. And if you're protesting, I think that you want people to see that you're protesting. And so my job is here to amplify that." And so there's been some argument back and forth saying that, you know, protesters have been doxxed, but I do think that you have to understand that if you're on a public street, your picture might be taken. And it's our job to disseminate information and to show what's going on. So so I've had to push back on some protesters, but I think that came more later, for me at least, when people started doing, when they took over the street in front of the Duke Energy Convention Center. Like, I was walking through, and some of the other reporters who were on this call too were there, and they were telling us that they didn't want us there. And I had to politely tell them, this is a public street. You know, I know that you're trying to take it over, but this is a public street and I'm allowed to be here too. And so sometimes when you push back, they kind of like don't know what to say to you. So I just kind of tell them what it is, and then I just keep on moving. So that's your choice.
I know there's not time in the moment to really give a lesson on journalism practices, but right. I often do think that the unschooled person who's maybe never been covered by the media, they just don't really know the rules of engagement. And, you know, these conversations can help, but of course we're talking to each other as opposed to talking to the public. So let's end with first, let's hear a little bit more from Lieutenant Sanders on what this July 15th conversation will be aimed at. Are you looking to come away with some new guidelines, or what's the hope?
So the hope with that is looking at our current procedure. We believe that there is some need for improvement, and out of that, there might even come what we offer our officers in lieu of going to training is a training bulletin. So hopefully we'll revise our procedure. We're looking at best practices from other law enforcement agencies and maybe some examples that we can use. Certainly SPJ has some great advice on your website, but we want to listen to our local media partners and representatives and find out, how are you trained? What should we be aware of? How this is a great conversation to get that information out. But we want to take that next Wednesday, scheduled from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. It probably won't go that long. It'll probably go about an hour long. But anybody who's interested, if you can't be there in person, because we are going to actually do it in person, we'll probably host a Zoom meeting as well, and looking for that feedback. So we're constantly looking towards continuous improvement, and this is an effort for continuous improvement, and that's what we're hoping to get out of that.
Lieutenant Murphy, any changes at Norwood underway, just based on all the dynamics that have happened the last few weeks?
Well, I've spoken to my chief again about just making sure that we understand exactly what the journalists are permitted to do. And again, the difficulty in understanding who is a journalist nowadays, because you do have a lot of people reporting for their own social media sites. So, but it is something we'll address. I'll probably either be there in person at Steve's or definitely watch it. But, you know, I can't stress enough just building relationships, though. I know Steve works hard on the relationships. I feel like I work extremely hard on building relationships with the media. And we essentially are working together. I mean, we both are trying to do our job, and we have to work together for that. So, but no, I'm sure it'll be addressed with my chief and our administration. We have a new administration in Norwood, so, and we're trying to improve on the services we provide. So, but it'll be something definitely we'll be talking about and discussing.
Jenny, do we need to wrap it up?
No. We need to, if we can, we've got a few minutes and there are a couple questions in the chat that have been
Sure. Let's
So
go to those.
One is kind of a sort of, not really a two-part question, but Max Lundberg had, a reporter from the Inquirer, had submitted a question in advance, and then Nick had kindly kind of given a journalist perspective answer to this. So let me ask the question, and then I think he wants particularly to hear from the police officers on the panel. But the question is, what steps should a journalist take when the Cincinnati Police Department simply ignores questions regarding a given issue or story? And Nick, I want Nick to jump in and share, if he wants to, the answer he gave. But then there was a little bit of follow-up from Max that he would really keenly want to hear from one or more of the officer panelists about those steps. That what can a journalist do when CPD or NORD PD is choosing not to engage with information requests as opposed to records requests specifically. So he's making a distinction between information requests and records requests. So Nick can jump in, and we'd love to hear from the police officers as well.
Sure, I'll be really fast because I want to hear the answer to the question that Max is actually asking. I think if the request is an information request or a records request, you can go to Ohio Court of Claims and file a grievance there and try to escalate that if the city or the CPD is not giving you the records. But I think Max was actually asking about more like response information that the CPD can give. How do you get that information? So I'm going to let other people answer that.
Sure. Obviously, if someone submits a record request, we have a process for that, and we'll do our best to fill that record request in a timely fashion. Sometimes there are questions about topics that come into us in the form of a email or phone call or text, and it's our prerogative to either respond or not respond. Sometimes journalists get frustrated when we don't respond, and there might be a multitude of reasons as to why we don't. Either we're not prepared to provide an answer for that topic. Sometimes there's pending court cases that are out there and we can't comment on those topics. So it's a pretty general question, but for my level, and maybe Ron can speak for his, there are also a lot of political topics that we stay away from. And sometimes the best response is no response from us. And it's difficult for a journalist maybe to accept that, but at the same time, it's something that we make that decision as to whether or not we should provide a comment or statement or not. And that's where we stand on things. So Ron, you have any feedback on that?
No, it's just the same. I mean, I also handle our public records, so I do my best to turn around a reasonable amount of time. But there are some things, that especially if I've already given a statement on it, I let that statement just speak for itself. I don't want to talk about it again. And go over it again. But yeah, we've had discussions, and I've actually, along with the city, been sued over records a couple times for not supplying records either in a timely manner or at all. But it's something we try to do, but it's not always possible.
Thank you, Jenny. Do we have another question from listeners?
Yeah. Laura Nunez asked, when we were talking about identifying journalists, whatever you might be wearing, so this kind of ties back to that, she asked, would it be wise to talk to the police department that will be working in the protest areas ahead of time, when possible, of course, sometimes we don't know when these things are going to happen, but in order to identify yourself, but also still be dressed as a civilian so that you're not a target for people who might want to target the media? So I think anybody could address that.
That sounds great, but I just don't know, like in a place like Cincinnati with so many officers, I'm not sure, it would be impossible, at least in my mind, to introduce. We have 46 or 7 just in Norwood, and I don't think they would, even if you came and introduced yourself to me, and then even if I were able to share that with them, I don't think in the heat of the moment they would probably remember meeting you or at least hearing about you, the person. So.
All right, why don't we end with each of the journalists offering a closing thought in terms of coverage of protests, anything that you're going to change, any message you're going to bring back to your newsroom about tonight's discussion.
I'll start.
Thank you.
I just want to say that I feel like through this process, we've learned a lot more about a lot of the nuance that exists in a lot of these conversations that are happening, not only in terms of very real practical things around covering the protests, but the protests themselves. And I think for a long time, we've been guilty of sometimes picking heroes and villains in narratives unintentionally. It's just kind of right into who we are as a society. And I think that hopefully we're trying hard to dismantle that. So I would just think, again, if you're walking into a situation where it feels like there's an obvious pro and an obvious con, to maybe re-examine that and examine your own biases as best you can before you walk into any of these highly charged situations.
I think one of my takeaways from the last several weeks and really the last several months has been really taking a step back and thinking about the issues that we've been ignoring. It's really easy to get into the run and gun of, okay, what story is going to be feasible for me to turn in the next 3 to 4 hours? And a lot of the time, those are crime stories or stories that might not have as much impact. And it's so important to do those occasionally, especially if there's trends in a certain area. But I think it's really made me stop and think about the communities that we've been ignoring a little bit and digging a little bit deeper. And I've had some conversations recently with several police departments just talking about, we've got to carry this conversation forward. And part of the reason we have to do that is so that people can see that some of the things that people are saying in these protests, they don't realize have already been done. And that's important for the public to know that. But then also some of the things that people are calling for, there are issues, and a lot of people within the police organizations and chiefs recognize that there are issues, and we've got to bring that conversation and continue it and take it a step forward and see what those obvious next steps are, what needs to happen that might be a little bit more challenging, but really not letting this just fade away after the impressive video is gone.
Right, harder stories to tell, but very important. Kara, Nick, I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, I think the points being made about kind of doing the homework beforehand and trying to understand as much as you can as you go into these protest situations are really, really important. And I think that homework includes kind of understanding what protesters are protesting about, but it also includes like trying to get to this side of the protest if you can early and talk to people who are already there and take the temperature of the space, and also talk to the police a little bit and try to see how they're, what they're willing to tell you about how they feel about the space. And also, like, if you've covered some of these issues before or somebody on your staff has, like having some of those articles on deck to provide context as you're covering, like tweet out a long form piece if you've got it about some of these issues and how they play out in Cincinnati, just to make sure that your readers have that available to them. So
I was going to say that one of the things that I thought that the Inquirer that we missed out on early on is who are these people that were leading the protests? Because the first thing I noticed was I didn't see anybody from 2015. I remember seeing like 2 or 3 people that I remember from a few years ago. It's like, who are these people? But then it made me take a look at back what I had been working on. Like, I kind of been out of the loop with working on stories of smaller people. Well, I shouldn't say smaller people, but people who are maybe not well known in our community. And I want to get back to doing profiles on people that people don't know who are doing good work. Just because you might not have thousands of dollars, you're still important to this community. And so I think as our staff, I think hopefully we can continue to build on that, and we're continuing to learn every week with these protests and meeting new people and building our relationship with the community and with the police.
Very good. Walter?
I think dialogue is important, conversation, listening to people. I know in my newsroom, I've had to talk to people about using civil unrest, the word civil unrest versus rioting. That's something that is very unique to Cincinnati. And I learned that by being out reporting. I think Kristen mentioned it earlier. And I think also just like realizing in your newsroom that, even though you may cover different communities, you may not understand. So I have found myself in kind of a role of duality because, I'm a journalist, but I'm a Black man, and I grew up in New York City, and I've been stopped and frisked, and I've had guns pulled on me. And so I've had to tell some of my colleagues, like, this has been my experience. And so I understand where some of these protesters are coming from. But I also know plenty of people growing up in New York City who have become police officers, and I've worked with several different police departments across the country. So you have to understand where they're coming from too. And so not everything is black and white. There's a gray area. And for me, I know that being here in Cincinnati, I've been here like a year and a half now. I have been impressed with the communication between the police departments, because I've been in other cities where the police don't talk to you. You have to sue them for records. They don't want anything to do with you. And it becomes a very divisive relationship, or no relationship at all. So I think conversation is key, understanding is key, and also understanding nuance. Like, some of the police Lieutenant Saunders has said, like, you may not know why we're asking you to move. So I'm kind of more like, okay, I'm gonna move, and then I'm gonna ask you why you asked me to move. You know what I mean? So it's better to move first. So I just think there's got to be some nuance, and there's got to be some listening, because the only way, we're gonna move forward in this country at all is by listening to each other.
Jack Greiner, do you have a last word of inspiration for us?
I'm inspired every day by the journalists that I work with. They're underpaid, they're overworked, and the job that they've done with the protests, with COVID, it's amazing, and it is what keeps me going to work every day, and I'm just delighted to be able to do it. And they're truly my inspiration.
Very good. I'll echo that, and I want to thank everybody for being here today. Thank you to the Cincinnati chapter of SPJ. Thank you to those of you who joined the call, and those of you who served as panelists. Carry on. You're doing God's work. Stay safe. Wear a mask. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.